Thank you, Matt, and thank you to the University of San Diego for inviting me to speak this evening. When Matt first contacted me, I think it was back in April, I kind of half had at the back of my mind, oh yes, this date will be very close to the presidential election. But I just thought, yeah, that'll make it interesting, I suppose, and couldn't possibly have predicted quite how interesting it was going to turn out. And it's one of the things that I'd like to talk about this evening, because there's a bit of a joke doing the rounds in the UK, although perhaps joke's the wrong word, perhaps relief is a better word to describe it, where people are saying, well, we had Brexit, but, well, we didn't have Donald Trump, and at least the pressure's off us now. I have to say this is not a joke, and it's not a relief that I share, because I think some of the parallels between Brexit and Donald Trump that are being drawn, most notably, I'm sure you're all aware, by Donald Trump himself, who said that his electoral victory would be Brexit times 10, are actually inaccurate, because I think it misses the point that the vote for Brexit was not a vote for one person, and it was not a vote for one particular ideological standpoint. Quite the opposite, in fact, it was a vote for freedom to determine a particular ideological standpoint, and it was a vote for freedom from the EU rather than a vote for a particular stance. However, I do think that there are some very interesting parallels to be drawn in the way that academia has responded to both the Brexit vote and Trump's victory. And I think these parallels also have very interesting implications for academic freedom. So this evening I'd like to look at 5 points of comparison between Brexit and the vote for Trump and show how these have implications for academic freedom, before going on to pull out some of the ideas from my book, Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, and really using those to help explain how we've got to where we are in academia today. So the first thing I'd like to look at in terms of Trump's victory, academia's response to Trump and academia's response to Brexit, is the emergence of an institutional perspective. And I think this has been far more explicit in the UK, from what I can gather, than it has been in the US. But in the run-up to the referendum, we, as faculty in the UK, we received emails telling us quite explicitly the university thinks, and the university's position on this referendum is. And I think that was very, very interesting, because for one thing, it raised the immediate question in my mind, well, who is this university that's thinking? Is it the buildings? Is it the senior management? You know, what does the university represent in this context? And how can the university have an institutional position? It also led a number of colleagues to contact me, people who maybe write in the media, and it said, well, if the university has a position, where does this leave us in terms of wanting to argue something different? Does this put us at risk if we want to argue something that goes against the university's position? It also made me think about the emergence of, or what I think of as the kind of formal emergence of academic freedom as a concept, going back over a century ago with the origins here in the US of the AAUP and the firing of academics essentially for challenging an institutional position on creationism or on striking workers, and how it was this challenging of an institutional position and the ability to challenge an institutional position that really brought to the fore the urgency of fighting for academic freedom. And it seemed to me that re-establishing the right of an institution to take a position on a particular issue really set the course of academic freedom back over a century. So then that led me to think then, well, why didn't more academics challenge this idea that the university could have a particular viewpoint? Why weren't people outraged to be receiving these emails? Like I say, I got 1 or 2 people contacting me, but essentially there was no challenge. Nobody even really saw this as wrong, that the university should have a particular position. And the only answer I can come up with is because the faculty supported the university position. So they didn't challenge it. They didn't think it was wrong that the university should have a position, because it was a position that they themselves agreed with. My husband is the head of the academic trade union at a university in Kent, and he was actually petitioned by faculty urging him to put out a statement saying what the union's position was on the referendum, basically wanting him to argue that the union urged people to vote Remain in the referendum, and he refused to do that and came in for an awful lot of stick because of that. But when I say that faculty supported this, I'm not just saying in my experience. There was actually a poll conducted by the Trade Journal for Higher Education in the UK, the Times Higher Education, and they polled academics about their voting intentions in the referendum, and it showed that 90% of academics intended to vote Remain, for the UK to remain in the EU. And now, with hindsight, we can see how out of kilter this was with the population overall. So my concern around US universities and Trump is that an institutional viewpoint doesn't just have to emerge with declarations from senior management, but can also come with an overwhelming political consensus amongst faculty members. In the aftermath of the referendum in the UK, one vice-chancellor or principal wrote in the national press to the effect that although he backed Remain personally, he didn't think that a Leave vote was the end of the world, and he did think that universities should try and adapt and make the best of this. And this guy has been absolutely hounded on social media and through the pages of the mainstream media because of this article that he wrote. And students at UK universities, I think, have been left in absolutely no doubt whatsoever from faculty, from managers, that there is a correct view to hold on the EU, that there is one correct position to support. And like I said, I think there's a danger that this could also be the case in American universities. I'd be keen to hear from you guys at the end if this is the case, that there is a position that emerges informally on Trump and the US election. So the second response then that I think you could see in the UK, that again, I get the impression is very much the same over here, the immediate response of academics has been shock. Absolute shock to the result of a referendum. They just did not see this happening at all. It was considered inconceivable that the UK would vote to leave the EU. And when you think about that in relation to the 90% statistic that I cited earlier, I think it does just show how out of touch academia is becoming with the rest of society. And there are times, obviously, when this distance might be useful. There are times when scholars might want to retreat, to explore intellectual ideas, to engage in reading and scholarship. But if your role, if you position yourself as somebody who is commenting on what's going on in society, and even more to the point, if your role within the university is to do with polling and political polling, actually knowing what people off campus think is quite important, and it would perhaps come as less shock if more diverse views were heard on campus. I think a consensus sends out the message that you can't say that, and it tells people whose views go against the grain, the consensus within academia, that they're not welcome in the university, or that they should self-censor or in effect shut up. So the third thing that we saw in the UK, and I think I'm kind of getting the impression is the case over here, is that the shock then morphs into this very emotional reaction. So in the UK, we talked about mourning. Students talked about mourning the fact that Britain was no longer in the EU. And you see similar rhetoric being used over here, the language of grief. So I can only, I'm afraid, go off what I've read in the press in recent days, and it seems from what I've been reading that students at universities here have been holding cry-ins, primal screams, sharing the telephone numbers for suicide hotlines, holding "fuck Donald Trump" chants, and again this language of grief of mourning, of healing, and it's a very psychological, very therapeutic language that's being employed. And to me, I would characterize this response not as a political response, but as an emotional response. And the irony is that in the UK, Leave voters and in the US, Trump voters are the ones who've been characterized as being over-emotional, driven by their emotions rather than by rationality, as being low information, as being lizard-brained, as being post-factual, and yet the emotional outpouring then is coming from the opposition to the Trump supporters and opposition to the Leave voters. I think the problem for me with this emotional response is that it leaves people unable to mount a political challenge to whatever it is they want to challenge. If you're stuck in emotion, to actually be able to come together and formulate a political response becomes that much more difficult. I mean, I must add at this point that I'm saying being passionate about politics is important, and I think it's long been a hallmark of student life. Certainly when I was at university, I joined the Revolutionary Communist Party. I was taken to one side by a very wise professor who told me that all the best students are communists. But then he said, but just so you know, the best communists are also the best students, which I think was his very wise way of telling me, don't forget to actually read a book every now and again and make sure you do some work too. So I'm all in favour of students being politically engaged. I think that's really important. But I think there is a big difference between political engagement and emotional outbursts. And I think the response, certainly as it's being characterised in the press at the moment from the US, is more of a kind of toddler tantrum, is how I would characterise it, a wail of unhappiness and outrage from students who've essentially been promised protection from offence, protection from ideas that they don't like, and suddenly are having to confront the reality that there are considerable numbers of people who do have ideas that they've been led to believe are dangerous, outrageous, offensive, and to suddenly be told that there are people who have these ideas and that you can't be protected from them, that they're unable to deal with this. However, as a rider to what I've just said, and kind of my fourth point in this kind of summation, we then see the reaction of this kind of mocking of students. And I do think this is quite problematic. It happens in the UK. It certainly happens over here a lot too. You know, I'm all for criticising students when they want to close down debate, when they demand safe spaces. But I think there are problems with that discourse. I think one problem is that students are being used quite unwittingly as pawns in a culture war, essentially. They are being exploited by the political left and put up to front protests that academics essentially would like to be holding themselves. I think they're also being exploited by the political right, who can hold them up for ridicule and mocking. And this is dangerous, I think, because it lets academics off the hook and it stops us asking the question, where have these students emerged from? I don't believe that students emerge fully formed and censorious, determined to ban everything in sight and demand safe spaces upon entry into the university. And I think it's really important that faculty really examine where these ideas have come from. And I think universities, academics and administrators have really done quite a lot to create a situation where emotional outburst is the only legitimate response to political debate. So opening safe spaces, bringing out the Play-Doh, the colouring books, the therapy dogs, cancelling classes, postponing exams is really telling students that this emotional response is legitimate. But I think more than that, we can go further than that and beyond just what's happening immediately. I think the message that's all too often come from faculty is that ideas can be dangerous, and more than that, can actually inflict actual psychological harm on people, that words can wound, essentially. The language we've seen recently has been the language of trauma, a vocabulary of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think when academics lead the way in saying that some ideas are so dangerous they need trigger warnings, students need to be prepared before they can confront them, and that these dangerous ideas are best avoided, best not dealt with, then I think it's perhaps unsurprising then that students take away this message that you don't deal with arguments by marshalling rational debate, but you outrage and wail. The final thing I want to look at in relation to the kind of Brexit-Trump parallels is the emergence of what's been characterised as post-truth politics. And I find this really intriguing because at the same time as promoting the idea that some words and some ideas are too dangerous to be heard, academics have also been at the forefront of criticising post-truth politics and the denigration of expertise by large sections of the electorate. And the thing I find intriguing is that this newfound love of truth and newfound love of facts is coming from the very same people, often from the very same people who seem to me to have spent most of the past 3 decades declaring that truth is at best multiple and perspectival and relative. And we've had this kind of undermining of the concept of truth in relation to knowledge dating back over 3-4 decades. And yet these university departments and academics who've been so critical of the concept of truth with a capital T are now very keen to tell us that these lizard-brained people don't recognise truth and are so scathing of facts. Essentially what we've been told is that truth needs to come with scare quotes attached to it. And when that idea has gone off campus, suddenly it's like, we don't like this. So, the second part of my talk, I'd like to look at how we've got here, if you like, and again, just really scratching the surface of some of the ideas that I look at in my book. So I kind of start with this idea then, this newfound love of truth. And as I've said, for the past few decades have been essentially anybody who has been an academic and talked about their role as an academic in terms of searching for truth as the goal of the pursuit of knowledge, as the aim of scholarship, has been met with derision. Certainly it's something when I've announced my role in terms of a search for truth, I've been mocked for pomposity. You stand accused at best of being naive. Don't you realise yet that there is no truth? And at worst, elitism, downright stupidity. I think academics in humanities and qualitative social science disciplines have largely abandoned the pursuit of truth as a stated goal of scholarship. But academic freedom, and even more significantly, the pursuit of knowledge, really depends upon the assertion of truth claims. And if we go back over a century, again, as I touched upon earlier, academic freedom was fought for so that proponents of evolution could challenge creationists. And this wasn't just about evolutionists asserting a kind of interesting but equally valid alternative to creationism from their perspective as white men. It was about pitching a superior explanation that would change our most fundamental understandings of the way the world worked. It was about asserting a truth claim about society, about the world as it existed. I mean, I think, incidentally, this example about creationism and evolutionism really brings home to me why we can never, ever use offence as the limit of free speech. We don't need to go back too far back in time, really, before arguing for evolution was considered very, very offensive. Likewise, the arguing that women could vote, likewise arguing that gay people could get married, these ideas were all considered incredibly offensive. And if we set the bar if we limit free speech at the point at which offence is caused, we leave ourselves unable to challenge any of these ideas, to put forward anything that could challenge the status quo. Academic freedom must, I think, mean the freedom to offend. But back to truth claims. Proponents of evolution were making a truth claim, but, and I think this is important, they also expected it to be contestable. They were not propounding a truth that would be held in perpetuity, or not necessarily held in perpetuity. Making truth claims does not put ideas beyond debate. It actually sparks debate and makes it meaningful. But today's newfound love of truth, and I kind of enjoyed Hillary Clinton's retort in the debates that I managed to get to see, the presidential debates that I got to see in the UK, and her constant, or so it seemed, her constant retort to fact checkers, are you watching this? You know, and drawing upon the fact checkers in that way. And you kind of thought, actually, you know, you should know the facts yourself. Oh, I thought you should know the facts yourself. Or isn't this about politics and ideas? And if we say that all politics is just about evidence and facts, then why bother having elections? Why bother having politics and debate at all if the facts tell us everything we need to know? You know, so this idea that asserting truth claims can help spark debate, but I think the newfound love of truth and fact-checking does precisely the opposite. It puts ideas beyond contestation. It suggests that anyone who even questions certain truths is obviously irredeemably stupid. Only the lizard-brained could have disregard for the facts. So we've got two positions, essentially. On the one hand, the it's all relative and there's no such thing as truth. And on the other hand, the this is beyond dispute. But I think really these two positions are both are two sides, essentially, of the same coin, and both threaten academic freedom and both curtail debate and both restrict the advance of knowledge. The subtitle of my book is Confronting the Fear of Knowledge, and it's this fear of knowledge that I would argue knowledge is fundamentally different to facts and information, and it's this fear of knowledge that I think really shuts down debate. I trace this fear of knowledge as emerging in the decades following the Second World War. The horrors of war and the Holocaust in particular were interpreted as an enactment rather than an aberration of Enlightenment values. The Holocaust was seen as a logical extension of the drive towards positivism, rationality, and the categorization of knowledge. So we see that Zygmunt Bauman, writing in Modernity and the Holocaust, argues that the Holocaust was not a regression to pre-modern barbarism, but actually intrinsically connected to modernity. He suggests that after World War II, all grand narratives were accused of oppressing minority viewpoints and were therefore discredited. And this rush to abandon Enlightenment principles was led by academics on the political left, who post-World War II found it increasingly difficult to defend the ideals of reason, progress, and universalism, upon which, and I think this is a really important point, but those were the principles upon which the tradition of the progressive left were built. I think something that's really tragic nowadays is that it's the political right that seems to have declared ownership of academic freedom. And I think this is tragic and new. And I think we need to remind ourselves that actually there is a long left-wing progressive tradition of a belief in academic freedom. And that just seems to have been lost, and it makes me very sad. But it was after the Second World War that theorists, particularly associated with the Frankfurt School, such as Adorno and Horkheimer, they really began to emphasize the temporality and the context dependence of truth in knowledge. Likewise, Marcuse, writing in One-Dimensional Man, argued that knowledge is ideology, or in other words, simply a product of the dominant economic and political conditions that gave rise to it. And this denies the possibility of there being any objectivity or any truth in knowledge beyond an exposure to the workings of power. In a 1977 interview published under the heading of Truth and Power, the French philosopher Michel Foucault declared that there is no truly universal truth. And this dictum became widely accepted within the academy. And so by the end of the 1970s, these views had really gained broad attraction among a new breed of academic who promoted this kind of stridently anti-universalist, anti-Enlightenment outlook. And this caught on among the new sociologists of education as well, and they really bought into this changing philosophical climate, and they posited that curricular knowledge was merely reflective of the ideology of the dominant social elite. So I'm not sure if it's a popular book in the US, but a very popular book in the UK amongst educators is a book from 1971. It's edited by a man who I'm actually now very, very good friends with, by Michael. He's called Michael Young. And it's a book called Knowledge and Control. And in this book, he argues that the educational failure of many working class children is a result of their knowledge and their experiences not being recognised in school and formally credentialised. So the French philosopher, I'm sure many of you have heard of, Pierre Bourdieu, again, really popular amongst educationalists in the UK, he suggested that schooling was a form of symbolic violence, that it reinforces class hierarchies through credentialising the tastes that correspond to those of the social elite. So teachers and the school curriculum, Bourdieu argued, portrayed the tastes of the elite as universal tastes, the opinions of the elite as ideologically neutral. And this creates a false sense that the most academically able were formally rewarded with success at school, and that society itself was a meritocracy based upon educational achievement rather than upon shared cultural capital. And I think if you think about those ideas taking root in the late 1970s and then think about how they play out today, in the UK we have a very, very popular movement, and I'm sure there are US parallels as well. It's called Why Is My Curriculum White? And it's this assumption that the curriculum is, again, reflective of the tastes of a social elite, that there's no universals in knowledge, that knowledge just reflects the perspective of the person who is propounding it. And it's become really commonplace for scholars to conceive of established bodies of knowledge as just a reflection of tastes and experiences of the elite, while the concept of truth and the notion of objectivity is presented as a myth propagated in an attempt to pass off this dominant hegemony as ideologically neutral. And this is played out, we can see, in discussions around the canon, discussions around the curriculum. There's no sense of there being any intrinsic merit to works that we might put on the curriculum, no means by which one poem, one philosophical text, one work of literature can be judged as better than anything else, or all are just judged as equally valid, all are reduced to the status of simply texts. So Paul Borghossian, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, you might know, in a very good book I'd recommend, Fear of Knowledge Against Relativism and Constructivism, he argues that the conviction of many scholars that the best philosophical thought of our time has swept aside the intuitive, objectivist conceptions of truth and rationality and replaced them with conceptions of knowledge that vindicate equal validity. And he argues that this lends legitimacy to the notion that there's no such thing as superior knowledge, only different knowledge appropriate to its setting. And whereas in the 1970s and 1980s, denying any relationship between truth and knowledge was considered to be radical, a subversive challenge to tradition, today it's become the norm, I would argue, within humanities and social science disciplines. And such academics have been diagnosed as suffering from a condition that seems quite prevalent, certainly within the UK, known as veriphobia, a fear of the truth. And scholars who continue to defend the pursuit of truth, to defend the idea that some knowledge is better than other knowledge, more worthwhile, more valuable, or maybe even universal, and not just judged important based on the skin colour or the gender of a proponent, are increasingly rare. In comparison to the perceived radicalism of abandoning truth, persisting in upholding Enlightenment values of rationality, truth, and objectivity has come to be interpreted as arrogant, foolish, racist, misogynistic, authoritarian, an oppressive political act which serves only to reinforce existing power relationships. I think when scholarship was connected to goals of truth and objectivity, the separation of the identity of the individual academic from their work was a fundamental principle of scholarship. But today, rather than demanding that every subjective element be eliminated, academics argue instead that objectivity is a myth and call for a recognition of the subjectivity of the researcher in the research. So rather than celebrating the universal, people are limited to their own experiences and restricted then to peering in at others. So an example of this that really made me laugh, again in the Times Higher Education, the trade journal of the UK universities, and there was an article, this is a couple of years ago now, about a new phenomena, although I would argue it wasn't terribly new, called me search. Where so instead of research, me search, where you are the topic of your own research project. And I think that, for me, really sums up the problem with this. Instead of knowledge taking people beyond themselves, it reinforces this focus upon the self. It becomes essentially, what I'm arguing here, is a narcissistic enterprise. It's about you. And I think, again, to kind of go back to what I was saying previously, I think you can see some very interesting parallels in the language of grief and mourning, the very emotional rhetoric that's sprung up over the past few days, where essentially what people in the UK were saying was that this vote for Brexit, it's all about me. You know, I can no longer travel to European countries. And I think you can see some of that in the response to Trump as well. You know, this is all about me and how I feel about this. But in terms of academia, this shift in emphasis towards me, towards the self, towards seeing knowledge as only understandable, only possible in relation to your own sense of identity, undermines the justification for universities that we once had, and universities that were premised upon the pursuit of knowledge through reason, critique, and rationality can no longer have that justification. So Michael Young, the guy who I was talking about earlier as the author of Knowledge and Control, the reason why I'm friends with him is because he published in 2008 another book. This time the title will show you exactly the shift in his own intellectual journey, if you like to use a very fashionable term. His latest book is called Bringing Knowledge Back In. And in Bringing Knowledge Back In, he argues that education presupposes the possibility of both knowledge and truth. He suggests that the rejection of truth as the goal of knowledge leaves only voice discourses and reduces higher education to an empty shell. The rejection of truth claims, I would argue, has had a devastating impact upon the liberal academic project of the pursuit of knowledge as truth. It epistemologically undermines the foundations for higher education. Without a relationship to truth, knowledge has no intrinsic meaning. Richard Rorty has expressed this sense of futility. He says the whole project of distinguishing between what exists in itself and what exists in relation to human minds, the project shared by Aristotle, Locke, Kant, and Searle, is no longer worth pursuing. I think when universities are no longer committed to the advance of knowledge, they become hollowed out institutions, and they become institutions in search then of a defining purpose. And I think one of the problems I encounter when I talk about higher education nowadays, particularly when people read just the title of my first book, Consuming Higher Education, and kind of assume that it must be a big critique of neoliberalism and the impact of the market upon higher education, people will say, oh yeah, but all the problems we've got in higher education at the moment can all be placed at the door of neoliberalism. It's all to do with tuition fees. It's all to do with the market. It's because students see themselves as consumers that we have all of the problems that we've got. But I actually think that's to read history backwards. I think it's because universities first lost faith in the project of knowledge, first lost faith in the pursuit of truth, became hollowed out institutions in search of a sense of purpose. It's because of that first that other goals have been latched upon. So what's very, very big in the UK at the moment, and I'd be interested to know if it's the same here, is employability. So the number one goal, I would argue, of UK higher education at the moment seems to be about getting people into work. Seems to be essentially, and this sounds very intellectually reductionist, essentially about job training. It's about what career do you want to have. So when I started working at the University of Kent, best part of 10 years ago now, we used to have what now seems very, very quaint in only a short 10-year period, what was known as a reading week. So this would be a kind of mid-semester break where classes would be cancelled for a week and students would read, or that was the idea anyway. Now we've dropped all pretense. We still have the week where classes are cancelled, but now it's called Employability Week. And we bring in people to the university who run businesses, and students can go to talks about what you do if you want to be a journalist or an accountant, this kind of thing. Likewise, the seeing the student as a consumer, I think, has also come in almost as a sense of justification for a university that's looking for another purpose. I think the vacuum then at the heart of higher education has become filled by a range of instrumental purposes, from employability skills, but I think from the individual academic's perspective, it's not nice. And I'm being kind of quite coy here, but most of the academics I speak to genuinely do not want to see themselves in relation to employability or in relation to students as consumers. They don't like to think that that is their role. Some do, and some are quite keen to go along with this. And particularly, obviously, the whole tuition fees thing is far more recent in the UK than it is over here. And some will argue that there is a moral duty upon universities to ensure that students are employable if they're paying such high levels of fees. But many academics do not want to see themselves as essentially job trainers. So the promotion of values then becomes another way of filling this intellectual vacuum, and it becomes a far more liberally palatable way of fulfilling this intellectual vacuum. The loss of confidence in pursuing goals in relation to truth and goals in relation to knowledge, that the loss of that project has left academics looking for more values-driven goals, I would argue. So goals to do with global citizenship is a very big thing in the UK, in UK higher education, and this idea that you can promote a concept of global citizenship, and that this is much nicer than just promoting instrumental goals in relation to employability, becomes a really big thing. I think it's problematic. I think it's more problematic even than promoting straightforward employability. Such goals often reinforce, I think, rather than challenge the instrumental and individualised agenda that the government wants to promote in relation to higher education. They say it says little about knowledge as a collective social project, but instead this focus upon values becomes a very individual thing, and it runs the risk of abandoning academic freedom altogether. It runs the risk of abandoning any questioning ethos in relation to higher education, and it runs the risk of diminishing the social role that higher education can play in relation to criticality. Because if we just think about it for the moment, if you're promoting values, then your aim is to get your students to demonstrate having met those particular values in relation to inclusivity, in relation to protecting the environment, in relation to global citizenship. And if a student then questions those values, by definition, they are not demonstrating them. And I think whereas things like global citizenship, the environment, these should be topics of academic discussion. They should be open to question. They should be things for people to debate, to consider, to weigh up arguments against. As soon as you promote it as a value to be adopted, then you are leaving people unable to critically engage with these ideas. So the problem is that in the contemporary university, I think some values are promoted more than others. So it's not just the case that we have a values agenda, but we have particular values also coming to the fore. So criticism of nationalism in the UK context then gives way to let's demonstrate our opposition to nationalism by backing Remain in the EU. So you can see how that political value translates into this is what the university thinks about this upcoming referendum. This is why the university urges you to vote in a particular way. Which values it is that should be promoted, I think, are determined not by students, and certainly not by a democratic mandate, but by a kind of coalition of the right thinking. By right thinking, I don't mean the political right, I mean a coalition of a dictatorship of the doctorates, if you like. We are cleverer than you, therefore we know what values you should espouse. It's very, very interesting. I found out earlier the strategic plan for USD here. The University of San Diego sets the standard for an engaged contemporary Catholic university where innovative change makers confront humanity's urgent challenges. And I think that statement's very, very interesting. I mean, there's obviously nothing said about the pursuit of knowledge, nothing said about the pursuit of truth, and nothing said about academic freedom. But I also wonder, what consensus there is there about humanity's urgent challenges. Is there agreement about what humanity's urgent challenges are? And is there agreement about the best way that humanity's urgent challenges should be tackled? I think foremost upon the assumptions underpinning this ethical stance, this values agenda, is all too often a kind of cultural relativism, often expressed most clearly in terms of respect for other cultures, but a very uncritical respect. It's a respect for difference that trumps the individual's capacity to criticize or pass judgment, as the relativist can neither judge nor question that which he or she considers to be fundamentally different. Teaching values rather than knowledge, rather than the pursuit of truth, suggests the intellectual, or more accurately, the moral outcomes of education have been decided in advance, that there is a particular right answer. Debate and dissent suggests that these moral values have not been taken on board and the students haven't learned the lessons that they were meant to learn. And I think this is fundamentally anti-democratic. And my concern with some of the anti-Trump protests taking place at the moment is not, I have no sympathy whatsoever and certainly would not have voted for Trump had I been here in the US. But there becomes a very fine line between criticising Trump and criticising the democratic outcome of the election. And I think that's a very, very fine line to get the balance right on, where criticism of Trump becomes criticism of Trump voters and criticisms essentially of democracy, criticism of what was democratically voted for, like it or not, was democratically voted for. If we teach students knowledge, we teach them they can decide for themselves, but this requires faith in students and it requires faith in knowledge. And my fear is that within academia, we're losing faith in both of those things. We're losing faith in students' ability to be presented with knowledge and to decide for themselves where they stand in relation to a particular body of knowledge. And too many people, I think, have also lost faith in knowledge as being something of universal value, something where we can make judgments about what knowledge is better, more worthwhile, more important to know, more worthy of a place on the curriculum. I think, and I can finish very quickly now, I think teaching values really encourages conformity, and this is what the kind of conclusion that I reach in my book. It encourages an intellectual, a political, a moral conformity. I think we see this emergence of a culture of conformity in the voting intentions of academics. So I cited the 90% who plan to vote Remain in the referendum, but a similar poll was conducted before the last general election in the United Kingdom, and I know going back over decades, similar polls have been conducted in the US as well, just asking academics about their voting intentions. And you see that how over a period of the past 50, 60 years, what these polls show is two things. Increased homogenization within the academy. So the UK, the last of these polls showed that 50% of academics intended to vote for the Labour Party, this is the kind of supposedly left-wing party in the UK, and 30% intended to vote for the Green Party. So not only do we have this increased political homogeneity, but we have an increasing dislocation from academia from the rest of society. So we put a great deal of emphasis in UK universities, a great deal of emphasis on diversity policies. I don't know if you use the same expression here, but widening participation is at the forefront of every university's mission. We want to reach out to what we call first generation students, students whose parents didn't go to university. We want to get a much more diverse student body. But all this attention on diversity is kind of a physical diversity. We want people with different skin colours, we want gender differences, we want differences to do with sexuality, but no emphasis is placed upon intellectual or political diversity. So all the time we've had this rhetoric of widening participation, at the very, very same time, the political homogenization has gone on as well. And there seems to be this view that I've never quite been able to understand, that if you get a kind of physical diversity then, based on gender, skin colour, sexuality, that will automatically lead to different voices, different viewpoints being heard within the academy. But if voting intentions are anything to go by, it seems like the precise opposite is actually the case. So we get the danger of kind of confirmation bias. And I think this is what you can see in the shock response to the election. No wonder academics are so shocked at the outcome. If we only ever speak to people who think the same way as us, if the only people within the academy are people who share our views, no wonder then the actual outcomes of the election, the referendum, come as such a shock. So the danger of confirmation bias when no one challenges or opposes us or asks the awkward questions. We also then see the end of academic freedom when it's attacked by government, which it is in the UK through something called Prevent Anti-Terrorism Strategy, and when it's attacked by students wanting to no platform particular speakers. Academics are not in a position to be able to defend academic freedom because they've done so much to undermine it themselves. And also because no one has anything different, sorry, I shouldn't say no one, but very few people have anything different, anything particularly controversial to say. So finally, just to finish then, I think it's really important, and I know this kind of contradicts everything I've said this evening, but it kind of needs saying that universities don't exist in a vacuum, that many of the things I've alluded to this evening are kind of broader issues going on in society more broadly. But on both sides of the Atlantic, I think universities have played a really significant role in creating a climate that substitutes identity and emotion for reasoned political debate. And it's this anti-politics. I think when we have identity and emotion, we have anti-politics. It's this anti-politics that's created a vacuum where the likes of Trump can thrive, and neither students nor academics are able to offer a coherent political argument against him, instead reducing the discussion down to hurt feelings and a betrayed sense of identity. I think if we're to challenge the likes of Trump in the future, we need universities to play a really crucial role in reinvigorating politics on campus. And that means reinvigorating politics in all its confrontational glory, kind of relishing in the battle of ideas and the clash of free speech. And we need academic freedom in order to be able to do that. I'll leave it there.
So we have some time for questions, and I'll just pass around the mic. We'll be recording for all this day.
Well, maybe I don't. Thank you so much for a substantive, stimulating, well-executed speech tonight. Wonderful. I have a couple of questions, a recommendation, and a comment, and I promise to make them all in under 30 seconds. Have you read Seth Rosenfeld's volume Subversives, which is a documentation of the free speech movement in Berkeley?
I haven't, no.
Okay,
I've got to confess, no.
You've answered that question. There's the recommendation. Rosenfeld, and it's called Subversives.
Thank you.
Clark Kerr was the first chancellor of the UC system at Berkeley, and I love a quote by Clark Kerr who says, "The role of the university is not to make ideas safe for students, rather to make students safe for ideas." And I think that you've encapsulated that quite well. Question that you might address. At this university, we do not have a union, nor are we allowed to unionize. Can you comment on the role of academic freedom and unionization, and I'll just leave it at that. Is there a relationship with academic freedom and the role of a representative body?
I think there could be, and I think there possibly should be. And I think certainly in arguing for academic freedom, I think a union could play a very useful role. My hesitance, if you like, is because a union is obviously only ever as good as its members. And I guess my hesitance and my reluctance to fully endorse unionization as a means to bringing about academic freedom comes from my experiences of obviously working in the UK, where you would never have a university that didn't have a union attached to it. In fact, I was told, and I'm not sure if this is strictly true, but I was told when I first became an academic that I had to join the union for insurance purposes. So the union plays quite a different role. But in the UK, I think there are worrying trends where the union is actually at the forefront of promoting a particular values agenda and doesn't challenge a lot of the ideas, certainly doesn't promote a political diversity, and the union can play a role in enforcing a sense of political homogeneity. So I would like to endorse what you've said about the importance of unionisation. But like I say, when academia as a whole becomes so politically homogenous, if the members of the union are drawn from that same political homogeneity, the union pushes a particular political line, and sometimes that line runs counter to academic freedom.
Wonderful book, by the way.
Thank you very much.
a supporter of academic freedom. So, thank you.
No, thank you, because I think that's a great question and great comment. And in a way, I think your question kind of answers your comment, but I will come back to that. First of all, just on what you're saying about academic freedom here at the University of San Diego. I mean, I was very privileged and very lucky this afternoon, and I pointed out at the time to go to one of these faculty discussions on the response to Trump, and I made the point at the end, Noel will vouch for me, I just made the point that, you know, in my experience in UK higher education for 10 years, I've never ever once had that kind of open, formal conversation about politics with my colleagues at the university. That has just never ever happened. So I've had to kind of travel however many hundreds of miles to be lucky enough to experience such a conversation. So I think you are in a good position at this university. In terms of the idea of academic freedom being used to open up diverse viewpoints, you know, I absolutely agree with you on that, but I think we can do both, if that doesn't sound like I'm wanting to have my cake and eat it. I think we can open up and say we want to hear lots of different voices without at the same time necessarily saying they are all equal. And I think what I'm saying about your statement answering the second part of your question, your question kind of lies in that response. So we have the same thing in the UK, where UK universities are also opening up branches in Singapore and Malaysia, places that not only have terrible human rights records, but in particular have a terrible record in relation to gender equality, for example. And you can see that this is a real contradiction that's emerging, because obviously gender equality is a fundamental value, and completely rightly so, at the heart of UK universities. But then you open up a branch campus in Saudi Arabia, and women and men can't sit next to each other in the same room. So how does the university reconcile this? And the way it does it is by saying, well, let's respect cultural difference. But personally, I don't think that's good enough. I don't think it's good enough to say we respect cultural difference, therefore we won't have men and women in the same room as each other. I think you can say, well, let's get all these ideas out there, but at the same time, let's not just say that they're all equally valid. Personally, I don't think a view that men and women can't sit next to each other in the same room to hear the same lecture is equally valid as the opposite argument that we can sit next to each other and hear the same lecture. So on the one hand, this kind of respect cultural difference really comes into contradiction then with the opening up of these it kind of plays into it, or rather, sorry, in my brain it's 2 o'clock in the morning, so I'm kind of really struggling a bit. But you can see how the respect cultural difference then kind of allows these branch campuses to open, and allows just this kind of the human rights abuses, the gender inequality, to kind of be passed with a nod. And I think actually it shouldn't be allowed to happen in that way. There should be more of a challenge to what's going on, but you can't challenge at the same time as saying, well, it's all just equally valid.
Bad news is probably only have time for one more question in here. The good news is we have plenty of time for questions out there, and there are beverages out there. So one more.
Thank you for coming tonight. This is very interesting. This kind of dovetails off the last question. Speaking about sort of the educational colonialism that's kind of happening through international branch campuses, which I have very strong opinions about otherwise, because I think one of the things which you're neglecting, or one of the things, maybe not neglecting, maybe that's too strong of a word, but the culture of the education. I know you're talking about like the example of the American University of Kuwait, where they couldn't have men and women sitting in the same room, so they built a wall down the middle of the classroom. And then the Kuwaiti government came in and said, not good enough. So, but then they wanted to sort of appease the American accreditation system. And the American accreditation system said, no, sorry, you can't separate. So then what they ended up doing is having double classes. And so faculty had to teach the same class twice, once for the women, once for the men. So I guess my question is, how much responsibility are you placing on systems of quality assurance or accreditation, which started out, I think, as a measure of exactly what it says, quality assurance, but has shifted along the way to being something that that mandates eligibility for federal financial aid dollars, which ultimately becomes the end goal. And so you use the word employability. That's all part of accreditation standards and quality assurance. And in Europe, in places like Europe where there are no transnational accreditation systems, each individual society, each individual country has its own model of quality assurance, or doesn't have any model of quality assurance. So I'm curious, how much responsibility do you place on those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think this becomes fundamentally an issue of academic freedom, because part of academic freedom was inherently bound up with the concept of academic judgment as well, and the freedom and the rights of academics to be able to pass judgment, essentially in relation to students' work, but also in relation to course content and the structure of what was going to be taught and what could be taught. And I think certainly in the UK, what we've seen over the course of at least 2 or 3 decades now is the ability of academics, the power, if you like, of academics to exercise academic freedom and pass judgment has been increasingly bureaucratized and taken away from individual academics and handed out to committee, if you like, and a committee which is not always made up of academics, or not always made up mainly of academics, but essentially made up of managers, and this kind of development of a new class within the university, a kind of intermediary class between administrators and academics, a kind of academic managerial class, and they then become a source of decision-making in relation to the kind of issues that you're referring to. And where this leaves individual academics then is not passing judgment from a position of academic freedom, but constantly in deference to the rule book, if you like. So we have pages and pages and pages of quality assurance, validation documents, module specifications, all these kind of documents in the UK. And where this leaves particularly new and inexperienced lecturers is kind of hands tied behind their back. So instead of being able to confidently assert, I think you have plagiarized this essay to a particular student, or this course content is not good enough, they have to defer to the rule book, and the freedom to be able to make those decisions is taken away from them.
And sometimes it's less of a freedom or a philosophical argument, and more of just a logistics. They simply don't have the time or the resources to be able to do that.
Yeah. And the sad thing is, I think for a lot of younger academics, they like this. They've grown used to this, and they want the rule book. And they want to know, what are the rules that I should follow here? So when a student comes to them and says, I can't have my essay in this week, I need an extension, instead of using their own authority to be able to pass a judgment on this, it's deference to the rules, and they actually like this deference to the rules, which is a shame, because what they are then doing is eroding the source, I think, of their own authority.